My name is Brian Manley. I'm the Chief of Staff with the Austin Police Department. I'm here today to talk about some of the issues and challenges we've had that are being reported on the Austin Police Department Crime Lab, along with some issues with the backlog. A little bit of history. The Austin Police Department Crime Lab has multiple different sections. We started processing DNA evidence back in 2004. We also have a chemistry section, a latent fingerprint section, along with serology and a few other areas. In talking about the DNA backlog, there's two different types of backlog that I think it's important that we distinguish between. The backlog that's getting a lot of attention right now are backlogged cases that we actually have a case, I believe the first one dates back to 1991, and we have 3,106 cases since that time. These are cases that were never submitted to the lab for analysis. They were submitted as evidence once they were collected, but then they were never requested for DNA analysis from the investigators. And there can be a lot of reasons for this. Some of those cases will involve a victim that, for whatever reason, chose not to move forward with their case. This is someone who survived a sexual assault but did not want to process through the criminal justice system with that case. It may be a case where we were able to secure a prosecution without processing that evidence. It may have been a known offender, and there may have been enough other evidence outside of that DNA safe kit that allowed for a successful prosecution. So for multiple reasons, these cases were submitted as evidence, but there was never a need to process these cases for the offense for which they were collected. And this is an issue that occurred not only here in Austin, but it occurred across the state and across the country. What we're now realizing is the best practice is we should be analyzing these cases. Although they may not have been needed to secure a prosecution in the case for which that evidence was collected, there may be a need to process that case to link it to another case where the suspect may be unknown. In other words, if we have a case with a known offender that we're able to secure a prosecution on based on other evidence, and we did not test that kit, if we test that kit and load it into the CODIS database, it could link to an unsolved case in our community or communities across this country. And again, this was a practice that was in place across the country. So we have crime labs across the country that are currently working through their backlogged cases. I think that's why we're seeing so much attention from different granting agencies that are making money available to clear up DNA backlog cases. The Austin Police Department is fortunate enough to have received a $2 million grant from the District Attorney of New York's program, allowing us to work on these 3,000 backlogged cases. And the first step in looking at these is a serology exam where we have to look at that DNA sample to determine is there even DNA in it. So the DNA analyst will conduct an initial test to get a presumptive result to determine if it then gets forwarded for DNA analysis. So we are working through those backlogged cases using the grant funds that we got from the District Attorney of New York. In addition to that, we have a backlog of cases that actually were submitted to the Austin Police Department's lab with a request that they be processed. And currently, as of this week, we have 1,253 of those cases, of which 600 are sexual assault cases. 208 of those cases actually have a DNA safe kit, and the remaining 392 are other pieces of evidence. It could be a piece of clothing, a piece of bedding, or something like that. So we have 600 cases in our current backlog that we have a request to process that are related to sexual assault. An additional 265 that are related to other types of crimes against person, and the remaining 388 are property crime cases. The main reason we have a backlog in the department, it's a capacity issue. We just don't have the capacity among our DNA scientists to process the number of cases for which we collect DNA evidence. An example, I guess just to give you the numbers that we have, we processed in 2007, we had a request for 639 DNA analysis for cases. This increased over the years. In 2008, 668. 2009, we went to 761. 2010, there were 844 requests. So this increase was steady over the past years, but it was most pronounced in 2013 when we ended up with 1,471 requests. This is the year in which we started collecting DNA in property crime cases. We realized that there could be benefits to collecting DNA in property crime cases for the fact that oftentimes a property crime offender becomes a violent crime offender at some point. So we began again collecting additional cases in 2014. We had 5 DNA analysts that were performing these analysis for us from 2010 through 2014, and we were able to secure 2 additional positions through our budget in October of 2014. The average caseload that a DNA analyst can handle is 10 cases per month. So if you just simply look at all those years we were operating with 5 analysts, our capacity was about 50 cases a month. And with these 2 additional analysts we got in October of 14, our capacity was 70 a month. And that has to take into account, obviously, we have analysts that will have to take time away for training, for vacation, sick time, so our maximum capacity was below the average 94 cases we were receiving per month. So we were just getting steadily behind with our ability to process these cases. So that's how we ended up with the backlog in the position that we're in. We're addressing that now. We've got an agreement with the Texas Department of Public Safety. They have agreed to take 20 cases from us per month. So these are cases that are in our current backlog, the 1,200 we just spoke of, and DPS has agreed to process 20 of those cases per month for us. On top of that, the Travis County District Attorney's Office is also getting cases analyzed if it's necessary for cases that are getting ready to go for prosecution. So there's a couple steps that are being taken right now to address the backlog that's in the system. This is the area where we're also making great strides with grants. We mentioned earlier this week that we were fortunate to receive a grant from the NIJ, the National Institute of Justice, $199,000. This is on top of a few other NIJ grants we already have that still have funding in them for working on the backlog. So we're using the money from these NIJ grants that we have to process our current backlogged sexual assault DNA kits. And then, as you heard us say during budget, and we stand ready to say again today, is that we're going to dedicate whatever internal resources we need also to cover the gap that the grants don't handle. We continue to seek out grants to assist us with our backlog, again, as do police departments and crime labs across the country. Everyone is trying to work through their backlogged issues. So that is our commitment to this community, to the commitment to the survivors in this community, and to those agencies that support our survivors, that we're going to take the steps that are necessary to clear up the backlogged cases in the manner that I just described. The timeline for getting these cleared up, as I mentioned, we're going to send out the 20 a month to DPS, and then we're also going to outsource the remainder cases to private labs. We're kind of at the mercy of those private labs, depending upon what their backlog is and what their processing time is. So we cannot give you an exact date when we'll work through all of the backlog, other than to say that it is our priority and we're putting all of our resources towards addressing that right now. There's another important thing we need to talk about today, and that is the crime lab itself. As you all are aware, we are currently have ceased doing DNA analysis in our crime lab while we do some retooling and retraining. But I think it's important also to talk about how did we get in a position to where we determined it was necessary to shut down our DNA operations. As I mentioned earlier, we opened up our DNA lab back in 2004. And since 2004, our lab has been audited 17 times. And these audits have come from different groups. One group is the ASCLAB Lab, and that is the American Society of Crime Lab Directors Laboratory Accreditation Board. This is our accrediting body. Other agencies that have come in and audited our lab have been the FBI's Quality Assurance Standard Assessment, the Office of the Inspector General, Department of Justice. We've had outside auditors come in. These will be individuals that lead crime labs in their communities. They have been part of audits of our crime lab. Out of these 17 audits that have been conducted on our lab since 2004, none of them had any findings regarding our casework and how we were doing DNA analysis. They had administrative findings. They had issues they might have brought up with the chain of custody or with the documentation. But as far as how we were conducting the science of our DNA analysis in the 17 audits conducted since 2004, there were no no findings that we needed to make any changes. So our scientists in the lab were operating under that belief that the audits and the accrediting board that came in gave us the seal of approval for the methods in which we were employing. Earlier this year, we had a few retirements of high-level managers out in our DNA crime lab. Our crime lab is actually over all of the different services. We took this as an opportunity to do a review of our practices from a management and organizational perspective. Do we have the lab organized in the best manner? Is it staffed appropriately? Are the divisions of labor set up appropriately? And so we saw this as an opportunity as we looked to find the next leaders for our crime lab operations to make sure the operation itself was structured appropriately. To do this, we reached out to the Major City Chiefs Association, and they have a forensic science committee. We reached out to them in January, and they agreed to send two of their lead scientists to Austin at our request to analyze our lab operations. From February 1st through 5th, these assessors were on site, and they conducted a very focused review of our operations to identify areas for improvement in our management, our organization, and our structure. They did not come in to judge whether or not our processes were compliant. This was not a compliance audit to determine if the science that we were doing, the methods we were employing were appropriate. This was an organizational review. And that took place in February of this year. And that audit did have several findings on changes that we needed to make to our organizational structure, our staffing, and management type issues. We had another review that took place May 27th through May 28th. And this was a review conducted by the Texas Forensic Science Commission along with the ASCLAD lab group that I described earlier. This was a review that was conducted by the Texas Forensic Science Group on all publicly funded crime labs through the state of Texas, based on some issues that had been identified in the methods labs were using to analyze DNA sources that have a mixture, in other words, multiple contributors to the DNA source. Based on their concerns that they had noted when they looked at the protocols of crime labs across the state, they wanted to go in then and do an independent review of all of the labs. During their review of the APD lab, they had several findings, three of which were very important and that I will highlight today. The three are the issues with the manner in which we were doing our DNA analysis. They dealt with a contamination issue, and then they dealt with using certain types of chemicals beyond the recommended manufacturer's date. When we looked at the issue of how we were conducting our analysis, the Austin Police Department lab was using a method called quant-based ST. And I'm not going to sit here and go into all the science behind that, but this was a method that we should have moved away from back in 2010. There were new recommendations and guidelines, although not statutory requirements. There were guidelines that we should have been following that came out of a 2010 analysis from the Scientific Working Group on DNA analysis methods. We call them SWAB-DAM. They came out with a new protocol in 2010, and what the Texas Forensic Science Commission audit of our department points out is that our scientists misinterpreted that, and they stayed with their quant-based method instead of switching to a new ST-based method. And therefore, we were using a method that was not the best practice anymore. Our lab conducted validation studies on this quant-based method, and the validation studies lacked sufficient data to support the method. But again, we continued to use this because we were getting regular audits, as we mentioned, 17 audits since 2004, and we're not having any findings that there were challenges with our processes. There were no other labs in the state of Texas using the method that we were using here in Austin after the 2010 SWAB-DAM report came out. Our lab was informed. The district attorney's office brought some concerns to us regarding the methods by which we were conducting our DNA analysis, But again, based on the multiple reviews by all of the agencies mentioned earlier, our accrediting board and the outside auditing agencies, our scientists felt like we were using an appropriate method. In short, what all this deals with is the methods in which we interpret our DNA results. We were using standards that we should have changed back in 2010 when we're looking at DNA cases with a mixture sample. The report also highlighted issues with contamination and actually lays out one case where we analyzed DNA from a survivor of a sexual assault along with a potential suspect that was linked to that case. The DNA analysis actually linked that suspect to the case when every other piece of evidence and every other part of the investigation did not link the individual. This individual was not a suspect and was not linked into this case. And that's what's important to know, is that DNA is just one component of any criminal investigation. We're not seeking convictions based on DNA alone, but DNA is one component. And so the investigators realized through all of their other investigation, through the statement of the survivor of that case, as well as other evidence, that this person could not have been involved. And what we believe happened in that case was that the DNA analyst actually analyzed the source from the survivor of that assault at the same time they analyzed the source from this individual suspect, and conducting those analyses at the same time, there was a cross-contamination, and that obviously is not something that is an appropriate practice, and we believe that that's what occurred in this case. We're going back and looking at the work of this analyst to ensure that this did not occur in any other cases. We're taking a look at a large sampling of cases from 6 months prior to this incident and a year after this incident, analyzing all of the work to ensure that we don't have any other concerns with any other of the casework that was done by this analyst. The other issue that was addressed and was brought up during this review, it identified 10 cases where an analyst used a contaminated reagent blank but still interpreted to the results. And what this showed is that they realized that the blank had been contaminated, but when they looked at the actual DNA analysis that they did using this, they just discounted those alleles where this contamination took place and made their identification based on the remaining alleles, when obviously we should not have used this at all. But again, they accounted for the contamination and removed it from their analysis, but this is not something that we should have done. We should not have used those tests. The last issue that I will talk about is that they identified a process where we were using reagents, and these are the chemicals that we use to conduct the initial analysis on a DNA sample to determine if it is of a large enough quantity and quality to where we should do a DNA extraction to do a DNA analysis. The manufacturer's recommendation for this reagent says to mix daily. Our analyst, we know of an analyst that was mixing this solution and then was using it until they used it all up. In some cases, it would take them a couple of days to use all of the solution that they had mixed, up to the longest period was 4 weeks. So we are currently looking at how that may have affected whether or not we forwarded cases for DNA analysis. In other words, if over the course of those weeks to up to 4 weeks, the reagent had lost an effectiveness to the point to where it didn't positively identify a sample that was strong enough for further examination. So we're going through a process now where we are recreating that. We are holding reagents beyond that day up to a 4-week period, and we're comparing the results from an analysis with that reagent with a reagent that was mixed fresh that day to see if there is any deterioration, and if there's any cases we want to go back and check again to see if we should be forwarding for a DNA analysis. What we have here is we have a failure where our checks and balances did not work. We had scientists that misinterpreted information that was guidance from a governing body, as well as from some of the leading DNA educational materials. We had 17 audits from various agencies and accrediting boards that did not find any issues with the way in which we were conducting our science analysis, but yet we were not following the best practices. for all of these reasons, we made the decision in June to shut down DNA operations in our lab. We realized that we want to make sure when we open back up that we're